Did he really just solve that in his head? The professor's voice dripped with contempt as he stared at the quiet black student who refused to sit down. Everyone watched in silence, wondering why this brilliant young man would rather stand through 3-hour lectures than take a seat. But Marcus Johnson had a secret, one that went far beyond his mathematical genius. When Professor Harrington decided to humiliate him with an impossible equation, he had no idea he was challenging the anonymous MJ theorem, a mathematical innovator whose work was being cited by experts worldwide. As Marcus stepped forward, chalk in hand and pain shooting through his back, he faced a choice: remain invisible or finally prove his worth in a world determined to dismiss him. What happened when Marcus revealed his true brilliance? And why did this quiet genius stand through every class despite the ridicule? Watch until the end for the shocking revelation that changed an entire university. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson stood at the bus stop, clutching his worn notebook filled with complex equations that no one but him would understand. The crisp autumn air carried whispers of change as he prepared for his first day at Westfield University, a prestigious institution where he'd earned a partial scholarship through sheer mathematical brilliance. At 20, Marcus's eyes held wisdom beyond his years, a quiet intelligence forged through hardship. His fingers traced the spine of his calculus textbook, dog-eared pages marked with his own annotations that sometimes corrected the author's work. Mathematics had always been his sanctuary, a language that made sense when nothing else did. "Hey, you're heading to Westfield too?" A friendly voice broke through his thoughts. A young woman with bright eyes extended her hand. "I'm Tanya." Marcus nodded, shaking her hand briefly before returning to his calculations. Social interaction had never been his strength, especially after what happened at Douglas Community College. The memory made his back throb with phantom pain. Ms. Keller, his previous calculus instructor, had been known for her strict methods, but no one expected her to become physical. When Marcus had politely corrected her differentiation error, she dragged him from his seat in a rage, striking him repeatedly with a ruler across his lower back, screaming about disrespect. The incident left more than physical scars. Despite witnesses and Marcus's stellar academic record, the administration had buried the complaint. Ms. Keller's family had connections. Marcus, the scholarship kid from the wrong side of town, did not. The medical report stated contusions and potential nerve damage, explaining the chronic pain that made sitting for long periods unbearable. Standing was now Marcus's only comfort during lengthy lectures. As the bus pulled up to Westfield's impressive stone entrance, Marcus felt hope mingling with apprehension. This was his fresh start, a chance to pursue mathematics at a higher level without the shadow of his past. "They say Professor Harrington's advanced calculus class is impossible to pass on the first try," Tanya chatted as they walked toward registration. "Most students drop within 2 weeks." Marcus remained silent. He'd heard about Richard Harrington, the department's star professor with 3 published textbooks and a reputation for academic rigor that some called cruelty. But Marcus hadn't come this far to be intimidated. In his pocket, he carried a folded acceptance letter and his student ID, tangible proof that he belonged here despite the whispers that followed scholarship students from his neighborhood. His mind was already swimming with differential equations and integration techniques, preparing for challenges ahead. What he couldn't prepare for was how his quiet brilliance would soon collide with Professor Harrington's arrogance, or how the simple act of standing during lectures would ignite a conflict that would expose not just mathematical genius, but the prejudice lurking within hallowed academic halls. As Marcus stepped onto campus, calculation notebook tucked safely under his arm, he had no way of knowing that his silent battle with pain would soon become a very public test of character, for everyone involved. The advanced calculus lecture hall resembled a theater more than a classroom, tiered seating facing a grand stage where mathematics was less taught than performed. At precisely 9 a.m., Professor Richard Harrington strode in, his tailored blazer and silver-streaked hair projecting authority before he spoke a single word. Marcus had arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a spot at the back where he could stand without disruption. The desk there would serve as a surface for his notes while he remained on his feet. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus," Harrington announced, his voice carrying effortlessly without a microphone. "Look to your left, look to your right. Statistically speaking, only one of you will still be in this class by midterms." A nervous ripple of laughter circulated through the hall. Marcus remained still, observing. "I don't believe in coddling minds that should be challenged," Harrington continued, opening his leather-bound planner. "Nor do I believe in participation trophies or grade inflation. Excellence isn't inclusive, it's exclusive by definition." Marcus noticed several students shifting uncomfortably. 2 rows ahead, a young woman with a headscarf discreetly closed her notebook and gathered her belongings, slipping out through the side door. The professor's eyes tracked her exit with something resembling satisfaction. "And another one gone," Harrington murmured, loud enough to be heard. "That makes the curve a bit easier for the rest of you." As Harrington launched into his lecture, Marcus recognized the calculated intimidation tactics. This wasn't just teaching, it was psychological warfare designed to eliminate students Harrington deemed unworthy. "Professor Harrington doesn't just teach calculus," whispered a student named James who had introduced himself earlier. "His brother-in-law is on the board of trustees. His recommendations can make or break your graduate school applications." The professor's chalk moved across the board with precision, elegant symbols flowing from his fingers as he derived complex equations without referencing notes. Despite his distaste for the man's methods, Marcus couldn't deny Harrington's mathematical fluency. "Ms. Chen," Harrington suddenly called, pointing his chalk at a student in the 3rd row. "Define the mean value theorem and provide a real-world application." Sophia Chen straightened in her seat. "The theorem states that if a function is continuous on a closed interval and differentiable on its interior, then there exists at least one point where the function's derivative equals the average rate of change over the entire interval." She paused briefly. "As for application, it explains why a car driving at varying speeds must at some point match exactly its average speed for the journey." "Acceptable," Harrington nodded curtly, his faint praise clearly designed to be withholding. Marcus noticed the department secretary slip in through the side door, placing a stack of papers on Harrington's desk. The professor acknowledged her with barely a glance, the same dismissive treatment he seemed to offer anyone he considered beneath his station. As the 2-hour lecture progressed, Marcus remained standing, making meticulous notes and solving equations ahead of Harrington's explanations. His back throbbed dully, a constant reminder of why he couldn't simply take a seat like everyone else. When class ended, Harrington made a final pronouncement: "Tomorrow's session will include a preliminary assessment. Nothing counts toward your grade yet, but it will show me who belongs here and who's wasting my time." As students filed out, Marcus noticed Harrington's gaze finally landing on him, registering his standing position with narrowed eyes. The professor's expression shifted from curiosity to something harder, more judgmental. Marcus knew that look. It was the same expression authorities wore when they decided something about him before knowing anything about him. It was the look that preceded trouble. The lecture hall was half full when Marcus arrived the next day, evidence that Harrington's intimidation tactics had already thinned the class. Marcus took his position at the back, setting up his notebook on the tall desk while remaining standing. Harrington entered precisely on time, his gaze immediately finding Marcus at the back of the room. A slight frown crossed his features before he addressed the class. "Before we begin our assessment, I need to address a matter of classroom etiquette." Harrington's voice carried throughout the hall, commanding attention. "University policy requires students to be properly seated during lectures." All heads turned toward Marcus, who felt his heart rate accelerate. He'd hoped to avoid this confrontation so early in the semester. "You there," Harrington pointed directly at Marcus. "Yes, you in the back. Is there a reason you're loitering rather than sitting like a proper student?" The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus cleared his throat, speaking clearly despite his discomfort with becoming the center of attention. "I have a medical condition, sir. Sitting for extended periods causes severe pain." Harrington's eyebrows rose. "Do you have documentation for this condition?" "Yes, sir. I submitted it to Disability Services during registration." A murmur rippled through the classroom. Harrington's jaw tightened visibly. "I wasn't notified of any special accommodations," he said sharply. "In my 27 years of teaching, I've found that standing during lectures is distracting to other students and often indicates a lack of respect for the learning environment." Marcus felt his cheeks grow warm. "I apologize if it's distracting, Professor. That's not my intention." "Intentions are irrelevant in mathematics, Mr. Johnson." Marcus Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Harrington's tone suggested the name was already being categorized and dismissed. "Mathematics deals in absolutes, not excuses. Take a seat with your classmates or excuse yourself from my class." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Near the front, Sophia Chen turned completely in her seat, her expression concerned as she watched the exchange. Marcus weighed his options. Making a scene would only draw more attention, potentially jeopardizing his scholarship. Slowly, he gathered his materials and moved to an empty seat in the back row, lowering himself carefully into the chair. The pain began almost immediately, a sharp, burning sensation radiating from his lower spine. He shifted, trying to find a position that would minimize his discomfort, but each movement only intensified the problem. "Now that we've resolved that disruption," Harrington continued, "let's begin our assessment. You have 45 minutes to complete these problems. This will show me who's prepared for the rigors of this class." The teaching assistant distributed papers throughout the room. When Marcus received his copy, he immediately recognized that these weren't standard calculus problems, they were deliberately complex, designed to confuse and intimidate. Despite the growing pain in his back, Marcus's mind clicked into a familiar mathematical rhythm. His pencil moved swiftly across the paper, breaking down the problems into components, finding elegant solutions where others might struggle with brute force approaches. 20 minutes into the assessment, Marcus had completed all 5 problems. He double-checked his work while trying to shift his weight to alleviate the now excruciating pain in his back. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, not from the mental exertion, but from the physical ordeal of remaining seated. Harrington paced between the rows, occasionally glancing over students' shoulders. When he reached Marcus, he paused, eyes narrowing at the completed solutions. "Finished already, Mr. Johnson?" His tone suggested skepticism rather than impression. "Yes, sir." Harrington picked up Marcus's paper, scanning it quickly. His eyebrows furrowed as he studied Marcus's approach to the final problem, an integration technique that wasn't covered in standard textbooks. "This methodology is incorrect," Harrington declared loudly, drawing attention from nearby students. "You've applied an unorthodox integration by parts that completely undermines the purpose of the exercise." Marcus swallowed hard before responding. "The method is valid, Professor. It's a variation of Feynman's technique that simplifies." "I'm quite familiar with Feynman's integration techniques, Mr. Johnson," Harrington cut him off sharply. "What you've done here is mathematical shortcutting that demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of calculus principles." Several students were now openly watching the exchange. Marcus's back was screaming in pain, but he kept his voice steady. "If you check the final answer, sir, you'll find it's correct. Mathematics isn't merely about reaching the correct numerical outcome," Harrington said coldly. "It's about disciplined thinking and proper methodology. Creative improvisation belongs in art class, not advanced calculus." He placed Marcus's paper back on the desk with obvious disdain. "See me after class, Mr. Johnson." As Harrington walked away, Marcus heard whispers behind him. Did he seriously just solve Harrington's impossible problems in 20 minutes? Who cares? Harrington's going to fail him anyway. Why doesn't he just sit down like everyone else? Marcus closed his eyes briefly, focusing on controlling his breathing through the pain. He knew he'd done nothing wrong mathematically, but he'd challenged Harrington's authority in front of the class, something the professor clearly wouldn't forget or forgive easily. By the time the assessment ended, Marcus could barely concentrate through the haze of pain. As students filed out, some casting curious glances his way, Marcus slowly gathered his materials and approached Harrington's desk, each step requiring deliberate effort. The real test, he realized, had nothing to do with calculus at all. The standing student, that's what they were calling him by the end of the week. Marcus had heard the whispers in corridors and caught the glances in the dining hall. After his confrontation with Harrington, word had spread quickly through Westfield's tight-knit mathematics department. "You should report him," insisted David, Marcus's roommate, as they sat in their cramped dorm room. David, a sociology major with an activist streak, had been incensed by Marcus's account of the classroom confrontation. "The university has policies against discrimination." Marcus shook his head, wincing as he shifted positions on his bed. The pain had intensified after being forced to sit through Harrington's 3-hour lecture. "It's not that simple." "Because he's Professor Almighty Harrington?" David challenged. "Because last time I reported a teacher, I ended up with medical bills and no justice." Marcus rarely spoke about the incident with Ms. Keller, but David had become something of a confidant during their first weeks as roommates. David's expression softened. "This isn't Douglas Community College, Marcus. Westfield has resources, oversight committees. And Harrington has connections," Marcus countered. "His brother-in-law sits on the board of trustees. You think they'll side with a scholarship student over faculty royalty?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their door. David answered it to find Sophia Chin standing in the hallway, clutching a stack of notes. "Hi, I'm looking for Marcus Johnson." Her eyes found him sitting on his bed. "I'm Sophia, from Advanced Calculus." Marcus nodded, recognizing her immediately. "The mean value theorem girl." A smile touched her lips. "And you're the standing student who solved Harrington's impossible assessment in 20 minutes flat." She stepped into the room when David gestured her inside. "Your solution to problem 5 was brilliant. Harrington was wrong to dismiss it." "You saw my work?" Marcus asked, surprised. "I was sitting close enough to peek when Harrington was critiquing it." She shrugged unapologetically. "The modified Feynman approach you used, it was elegant. More efficient than what Harrington wanted us to do." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Having someone recognize the validity of his work meant more than he wanted to admit. "I've been trying different positions all week," Marcus confided, gesturing to the arrangement of pillows on his bed. "But nothing helps for long." "Have you been to the University Health Center?" Sophia asked, concern evident in her voice. Marcus hadn't. The memory of doctors dismissing his pain after the incident with Ms. Keller had left him wary of medical professionals who might judge him before examining him. "I've got some family in medical fields," Sophia offered. "My aunt's a physical therapist. She always says unaddressed pain only gets worse." Their conversation shifted to mathematics, and Marcus found himself relaxing as they discussed various approaches to complex integration. Sophia wasn't just bright, she had a gift for explaining concepts clearly, breaking down Harrington's dense lectures into more digestible components. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there's this online mathematics forum where people discuss unorthodox approaches. Some really brilliant minds contribute there. Have you ever considered sharing your methods?" Marcus hesitated. "I've published some solutions under a pseudonym. MJ Theorem." Sophia's eyes widened. "Wait, your MJ Theorem? The one who provided that elegant proof for the convergence problem last year? That was published in the Undergraduate Mathematics Journal." David looked between them, bemused by their excitement over what sounded to him like mathematical gibberish. Marcus felt a flash of pride, quickly tempered by caution. "I prefer to keep that private. The mathematics should speak for itself, not the person behind it." "But don't you see?" Sophia leaned forward earnestly. "If Harrington knew who you really are, he'd still see what he wants to see," Marcus interrupted firmly. "Trust me, I learned that lesson the hard way." As Sophia gathered her notes to leave, she paused at the door. "Just think about the health center, okay? And know that not everyone in class agrees with Harrington's assessment of your work." After she left, David gave Marcus a knowing look. "Sounds like you've got an ally." "Maybe," Marcus conceded. Or maybe just a fellow math enthusiast. That night, as pain kept him awake, Marcus stared at the ceiling and recalled the look in Harrington's eyes when he challenged the professor's authority. It was the same look Ms. Keller had worn just before she dragged him from his seat, that moment when professional facade gave way to something darker, more personal. Marcus had promised himself never to be vulnerable to that kind of authority again. Yet here he was, caught between his passion for mathematics and another power-hungry teacher who'd already decided his worth based on superficial judgments. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the world of mathematics, where objective truth should reign supreme, he kept encountering the most subjective human prejudices. The atmosphere in the lecture hall crackled with tension as Professor Harrington paced at the front of the room, a stack of papers in his hands. 2 weeks into the semester, the class had already shrunk by a third, exactly as Harrington had predicted. "Today's pop quiz," Harrington announced, his voice carrying to the back row where Marcus once again stood at his tall desk, "will separate those who merely attend my lectures from those who truly comprehend calculus at its deepest level." Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his stomach. Since their confrontation, Harrington had largely ignored him, creating an uneasy détente that Marcus knew wouldn't last. The teaching assistant distributed the papers. When Marcus received his copy, his suspicions were confirmed. These weren't standard problems but deliberately obscure applications designed to frustrate even well-prepared students. "You have 30 minutes, Harrington announced, setting his timer with a theatrical flourish. "Begin." Marcus scanned the 5 problems quickly, recognizing that the third and fifth were particularly challenging. They required not just technical skill but creative insight, the very approach Harrington had criticized him for previously. Ignoring the contradiction, Marcus focused on the task at hand. His pencil moved efficiently across the paper, his mind translating the complex problems into visual patterns that revealed their underlying structure. Problem 5 involved a 3-dimensional optimization scenario that most students would approach through partial derivatives and constraint equations, technically correct but computationally intensive. Marcus saw a simpler path through geometric reasoning combined with a specialized integration technique. He completed the quiz with 10 minutes to spare, double-checking his work carefully. Around him, students were still struggling with the earlier problems, expressions of frustration evident on their faces. When Harrington called time, the teaching assistant collected the papers. Marcus noticed Harrington watching him specifically, a calculating look in his eyes. "Remain seated while I review your work," Harrington instructed. "I'll address some common errors before you leave." Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to alleviate the persistent ache in his back. Standing for extended periods was uncomfortable, but infinitely preferable to sitting. After several minutes of tense silence, Harrington looked up from the papers with a thin smile. "Disappointing, though not surprising. Most of you have failed to grasp even the fundamental concepts necessary for these applications." He held up one paper. "However, we have an interesting case here. Mr. Johnson has once again employed unconventional methods to arrive at his answers." All eyes turned toward Marcus, who maintained a neutral expression despite the knot forming in his stomach. "While the numerical results appear correct," Harrington continued, his tone suggesting this was despite rather than because of Marcus's approach, "the methodology demonstrates a troubling pattern of mathematical shortcuts that circumvent the rigorous processes this course is designed to teach." Sophia, sitting near the front, raised her hand. "Professor, if the solutions are correct, doesn't that validate the methodology?" Harrington's expression hardened. "Mathematics is not merely about reaching the correct endpoint, Ms. Chen. It's about disciplined thinking and standardized approaches that can be replicated and verified. Creative improvisation might impress in undergraduate courses, but it has no place in serious mathematical study." Marcus felt a flash of indignation. What Harrington was dismissing as creative improvisation was actually built on solid theoretical foundations, approaches published in respected journals that Harrington himself should have recognized. "Mr. Johnson," Harrington addressed him directly now. "Your pattern of unorthodox solutions suggests either exceptional intuition or—" He paused meaningfully, prior access to these specific problems. The implication hung in the air. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I've never seen these problems before, Professor," Marcus stated calmly, though his heart was racing. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain your reasoning for problem 5 to the class." Harrington's challenge carried a trap, forcing Marcus to either admit inability or publicly contradict the professor's preferred methodology. Before Marcus could respond, the bell signaled the end of class time. Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes as he gathered the quiz papers. "We'll continue this discussion next session. Mr. Johnson, I expect a formal write-up of your methodology for problem 5, with rigorous justification for each step. Due tomorrow morning." As students filed out, Sophia lingered, approaching Marcus with concern in her eyes. "That was completely unfair. He practically accused you of cheating." Marcus gathered his materials slowly. "It's not about fairness. It's about control." "You should talk to Dr. Wright, the department chair," Sophia suggested. "Harrington can't just—" "I need this class to graduate," Marcus interrupted quietly. "And Harrington knows it." What he didn't say was how familiar this pattern felt: authority figures using their power to isolate and discredit, creating impossible standards that shifted whenever he met them. The pain in his back throbbed as a physical reminder of what happened the last time he'd challenged a teacher too directly. As they left the lecture hall, Marcus noticed Harrington watching them with narrowed eyes. The professor's challenge wasn't really about mathematical methodology, it was a gauntlet thrown down, a test of how far Marcus would go to defend his approach. And they both knew it. The University Medical Center was busier than Marcus expected for a Thursday afternoon. He sat awkwardly in the waiting room, shifting positions every few minutes as the plastic chair aggravated his back pain. After weeks of Sophia's gentle persistence, he'd finally relented and made an appointment. The constant pain had become unbearable, especially after Harrington's increasingly hostile classroom tactics forced him to sit for demonstrations. "Marcus Johnson." A nurse called his name, leading him to an examination room. Dr. Patel, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed his intake form with a furrowed brow. "It says here you're experiencing chronic lower back pain from an old injury. Can you tell me more about that?" Marcus hesitated, then provided a sanitized version of the incident with Ms. Keller. "My previous instructor became physical during a disagreement. I was struck repeatedly across my lower back." Dr. Patel's expression remained professional, but her eyes reflected concern. "And was this reported? Were you examined at the time?" "Yes to both. Nothing came of the report. The doctor said I had contusions and possible nerve damage, but the school's insurance wouldn't cover further testing." Dr. Patel nodded slowly. "I'd like to do a proper examination and possibly order some imaging. This kind of injury, especially left untreated, can worsen over time." As she examined him, Marcus found himself sharing more details than he'd intended, about Harrington's class, about standing during lectures, about the repeated humiliations disguised as academic rigor. "Education shouldn't cause physical pain," Dr. Patel said firmly, making notes in his chart. "I'm going to document this properly and send a formal accommodation request to Disability Services. Professor Harrington will be required to honor it." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. An official medical directive might force Harrington to back down, at least regarding the standing issue. Meanwhile, across campus, Dr. Eleanor Wright was in her office reviewing departmental matters when a notification appeared in her university email. The subject line read, "Potential Academic Misconduct, Advanced Calculus Section." Opening it revealed a message from Professor Harrington, detailing concerns about a student named Marcus Johnson who consistently used suspicious methodologies that suggested either cheating or inappropriate mathematical approaches detrimental to proper learning. Dr. Wright sighed. This wasn't the first such complaint from Harrington, whose stringent standards often bordered on unreasonable. She was about to file it for later review when a name in the email caught her attention: MJ Theorem. Harrington had written, "The student claims his unorthodox approach to problem 5 resembles techniques published under the pseudonym MJ Theorem, which itself represents questionable mathematical scholarship." Dr. Wright straightened in her chair. Unlike Harrington, she was intimately familiar with MJ Theorem's work, brilliant, innovative approaches to classic problems that had garnered attention in several respected journals. She'd even corresponded with the anonymous mathematician, whose insights had contributed to her own research. Could Marcus Johnson actually be MJ theorem? The initials matched, and if so, Harrington was unwittingly attempting to discredit one of the more promising young mathematical minds she'd encountered in recent years. With renewed interest, Dr. Wright opened the university database and searched for Marcus Johnson's records. His academic history was impressive, perfect scores in all previous mathematics courses despite transferring from an underfunded community college. His entrance exam scores were among the highest in his cohort. And there was something else. A flag on his medical records indicated an ongoing accommodation request for a back injury, with notes about standing during lectures due to chronic pain. Dr. Wright tapped her fingers thoughtfully on her desk. If Marcus was indeed MJ theorem, his unorthodox approaches weren't evidence of academic dishonesty but of mathematical creativity too advanced for Harrington's rigid pedagogical framework. Her computer chimed with another notification, this one from Disability Services, copying her on an accommodation approval for Marcus Johnson, requiring all mathematics department professors to allow him to stand during lectures and exams. The timing couldn't have been better. This official accommodation would provide immediate relief for one issue, while she discreetly investigated the possible connection to MJ theorem. Dr. Wright composed a brief, neutral reply to Harrington, stating she would look into the matter but reminding him of the university's obligation to honor medical accommodations. She strategically omitted any mention of MJ theorem, deciding that particular revelation, if confirmed, deserved a more careful approach. As the sun set over Westfield's campus, Marcus sat in his dorm room, carefully reviewing his latest mathematical paper before submitting it to the undergraduate mathematics journal under his pseudonym. This proof, exploring an elegant connection between differential geometry and optimization theory, represented his finest work to date. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same mathematical insights Harrington dismissed as inappropriate shortcuts in class were being reviewed for publication by respected mathematicians worldwide. The pseudonym that had started as a protection against prejudice had become a mathematical identity in its own right, one that existed purely on the merit of his ideas rather than preconceptions about who he was or where he came from. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Dr. Wright was asking about you today. Something about a proof methodology similar to yours. Everything okay? Marcus stared at the message, a mixture of concern and curiosity flooding through him. Had someone made the connection between Marcus Johnson and MJ theorem? And if so, what would that mean for his already complicated academic situation? He responded with casual brevity, interesting. Probably nothing. See you in class tomorrow. But as he returned to his proof, the quiet sanctuary of pure mathematics suddenly felt less secure. The worlds he'd kept carefully separated, his identity as a student navigating prejudice and pain, and his anonymous contributions to mathematical knowledge, were threatening to collide in unpredictable ways. Today, Professor Harrington announced with barely concealed satisfaction, we'll be examining common methodological errors in approaching complex integration problems. The lecture hall was unusually full. Word had spread that Harrington was planning something special for this session. Marcus stood at his customary spot in the back, now officially sanctioned by his medical accommodation, which Harrington had acknowledged with thinly veiled resentment. I've selected an exemplary case study from our recent assessments, Harrington continued, projecting a familiar-looking solution onto the screen behind him. This approach represents a fundamental misunderstanding of mathematical rigor. Marcus felt his stomach drop. On the screen was his solution to problem 5, the one Harrington had challenged him to justify. Though his name had been removed, everyone who had been present during their previous confrontation would recognize whose work was being dissected. Notice the attempt to circumvent standard differentiation procedures in favor of a geometric shortcut. Harrington pointed to the first step of Marcus's solution. While this might appear clever to the untrained eye, it actually demonstrates a concerning pattern of mathematical laziness. From her seat near the front, Sophia turned to catch Marcus's eye, her expression a mixture of outrage and sympathy. Several other students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the public humiliation being orchestrated. For 45 excruciating minutes, Harrington systematically dismantled Marcus's approach, using deliberately dismissive language, amateur approximation, undergraduate oversimplification, imprecise intuition masquerading as insight. Marcus maintained a carefully neutral expression throughout, though his hands gripped his pencil so tightly it nearly snapped. This wasn't about mathematics anymore, it was a calculated attempt to undermine his confidence and standing among his peers. The most concerning aspect, Harrington was saying, is the claim that this approach derives from published work. If such work exists, it represents precisely the kind of mathematical corner-cutting that serious institutions reject. Something in Marcus finally snapped. The accumulated weight of weeks of discrimination, the echoes of past injustice, and the deliberate misrepresentation of his work pushed him past his usual caution. "Excuse me, Professor," he called from the back of the room, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "That methodology is published in the Journal of Mathematical Innovation, Volume 43, under Geometric Approaches to Multivariable Optimization." A stunned silence fell over the lecture hall. Students turned in their seats to stare at Marcus, who had never before interrupted Harrington's lectures. Harrington's expression hardened. "I'm quite familiar with that journal, Mr. Johnson, and I don't recall any such article." "It was published last spring," Marcus continued, a strange calm settling over him now that he'd committed to speaking up. "The approach is valid and produces correct results with fewer computational steps." "Perhaps in your opinion," Harrington countered, his voice dangerously quiet. "But this class isn't governed by student opinions, particularly those based on questionable sources." "The mathematics isn't a matter of opinion, Professor," Marcus replied. "The solution is either valid or it isn't. The methodology either works or it doesn't." Murmurs spread through the classroom. Harrington's face flushed slightly as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. "Very well, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice ringing with challenge. "Since you're so confident in your approach, perhaps you'd care to demonstrate its validity on a more complex problem." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote out an equation that made several students gasp. It was a notorious differential equation with no closed-form solution, a problem typically reserved for graduate-level seminars. "Solve this," Harrington demanded, extending a marker toward Marcus. "Show us how your innovative approach handles a genuine mathematical challenge." The trap was obvious, the equation was deliberately chosen to be unsolvable through standard methods. If Marcus failed, Harrington would have public vindication for his criticism. Marcus hesitated, aware of every eye in the room fixed on him. His back throbbed with tension as he considered his options. Walking away would concede Harrington's point, accepting the challenge risked public failure. Slowly, he gathered his notebook and made his way to the front of the room. As he took the marker from Harrington's hand, he caught sight of Sophia discreetly positioning her phone to record the exchange. 30 minutes, Harrington announced, his tone suggesting even this generous time allowance wouldn't be sufficient. "Let's see this published methodology in action." Marcus faced the whiteboard, studying the equation. It was indeed formidable, a multivariable differential equation with irregular boundary conditions. But as he absorbed its structure, he recognized that it belonged to a class of problems he'd explored in his private research. The lecture hall fell silent as Marcus began to write, his marker moving with deliberate precision across the board. His approach wasn't to solve the equation directly, which Harrington knew was impossible, but to transform it into an equivalent form that revealed key properties of its solution space. 10 minutes in, Harrington's satisfied expression began to falter as he recognized elements of advanced mathematics that went beyond the undergraduate curriculum. By 20 minutes, his smugness had been replaced by confusion, then growing concern as Marcus continued to work through a methodology that Harrington himself wasn't entirely following. "Time," Harrington called prematurely, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Let's examine what you've produced." But Marcus didn't stop. "I need 5 more minutes to complete the demonstration, Professor. Unless you prefer an incomplete analysis." The challenge in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Several students exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Harrington had no choice but to acquiesce or admit he couldn't evaluate the work in progress. 5 minutes, he conceded tersely. When Marcus finally set down the marker, the whiteboard was filled with elegant mathematical notation connecting the original equation to a geometric interpretation that revealed key insights about its solution structure. It wasn't a direct solution, which was impossible, but a sophisticated analysis that extracted meaningful results from an intractable problem. As you can see, Marcus explained quietly, while this equation has no closed-form solution, we can characterize its behavior completely through this geometric transformation. The approach follows the principles outlined in that journal article, applied to a more complex case. The silence in the room was deafening. Even students who couldn't follow the advanced mathematics recognized that something extraordinary had just occurred. Harrington stared at the board, his expertise sufficient to recognize the validity of the approach but his pride preventing him from acknowledging it. Finally, he cleared his throat. An interesting attempt, Mr. Johnson. However, what you've presented is merely an analysis framework, not an actual solution. The original challenge remains unmet. It was a desperate move, redefining the parameters of success after the fact. Several students frowned, recognizing the unfairness of this assessment. Professor, Marcus responded quietly, the original equation is provably unsolvable in closed form. The challenge of mathematics isn't just finding answers, but asking the right questions about what we can know about seemingly unsolvable problems. Isn't that what you teach us? Turning Harrington's own philosophical stance against him was a calculated risk. For a moment, the professor seemed at a loss for words, caught between his mathematical integrity and his personal animosity. We'll continue this discussion in my office, Harrington finally said, dismissing the class abruptly. The rest of you, read chapters 7 through 9 for next session. As students gathered their belongings, many cast appraising looks at Marcus. Something fundamental had shifted in the classroom dynamic. Whether or not they understood the mathematics, they had witnessed Harrington's authority challenged not through defiance, but through superior mathematical insight. Sophia caught up with Marcus as he left the lecture hall. That was incredible, she whispered, showing him her phone. I recorded the whole thing. People need to see this. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions, satisfaction at demonstrating his knowledge, anxiety about the consequences, and a lingering sense that this confrontation had escalated beyond mathematics into something more personal and potentially dangerous to his academic future. What he didn't yet realize was that Dr. Wright had slipped into the back of the classroom midway through his demonstration, witnessing both his mathematical brilliance and Harrington's obvious bias. And she had recognized exactly what she was seeing, MJ theorem, in the flesh, bringing his published insights to life on a Westfield University whiteboard. The video spread through Westfield's mathematics department like wildfire. Sophia's recording, showing Marcus transforming an unsolvable equation into a brilliant geometric analysis while Harrington struggled to follow, had been shared in study groups, group chats, and even among several junior faculty members. Professor Harrington looks completely lost around minute 17, commented a graduate teaching assistant, as a group huddled around a laptop in the mathematics building lounge. I've never seen anyone challenge him like that. That's because no one has dared to, replied another. But look at the approach, it's elegant. I've seen similar methodology in some recent journal publications. A young professor leaned closer to the screen. Wait a minute. That transformation step, that's MJ theorem's signature approach. I cited it in my dissertation last year. The name caught the attention of everyone in the group. MJ theorem had become something of a minor celebrity in mathematical circles, an anonymous contributor whose innovative proofs had influenced recent research directions. You think Johnson is MJ theorem? Someone asked skeptically. The initials match, the professor noted. And that geometric visualization is identical to the technique in the convergence problem proof. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in the university library, trying to focus on his textbook while ignoring the glances and whispers from nearby students. The aftermath of his confrontation with Harrington had made him uncomfortably visible, exactly what he'd always tried to avoid. His phone vibrated with a text from Sophia, Dr. Wright wants to see you. Her office. ASAP. Marcus's stomach tightened. Being summoned by the department chair could mean anything from academic discipline to, less likely, recognition of his work. Given his history with academic authorities, he wasn't optimistic. Dr. Eleanor Wright's office reflected her approach to mathematics, organized yet creative, with bookshelves containing everything from classic textbooks to avant-garde mathematical art. When Marcus entered, she gestured for him to take a seat or stand as he preferred. That small courtesy, acknowledging his physical needs without comment, immediately set her apart from Harrington in Marcus's mind. "I witnessed the latter half of your demonstration yesterday," Dr. Wright began without preamble. "Quite impressive work, especially under pressure." Marcus remained cautiously neutral. "Thank you, Dr. Wright. Professor Harrington has filed a complaint," she continued, watching his reaction carefully. "He's suggesting your approach represents unacceptable deviation from standard mathematical pedagogy." Marcus had expected as much. "I understand his perspective, but the methodology is mathematically sound." "Yes, it is." Dr. Wright leaned forward slightly. "In fact, it bears striking resemblance to published work I've studied closely, papers authored by a mathematician who publishes under the pseudonym M.J. Theorem." The moment stretched between them, Wright watching him intently while Marcus maintained his composed expression despite his racing heart. "Interesting coincidence," he finally responded. Dr. Wright smiled slightly. "Indeed. Especially since I've corresponded with M.J. Theorem regarding several proofs over the past 2 years. Their insights on the convergence problem were particularly helpful for my research on limit behaviors in complex systems." She opened a drawer and removed a folder containing printed emails. "The writing style is distinctive. As is the mathematical intuition." Marcus said nothing, years of protective caution holding him back despite the apparent opportunity for recognition. "Marcus," Dr. Wright's tone softened, "your secret is safe with me if that's what you prefer. But I want you to understand something important. What Professor Harrington dismisses as shortcuts or unorthodox methods represents genuine innovation that many established mathematicians, myself included, consider valuable contributions to the field." The validation from someone of Dr. Wright's stature momentarily overwhelmed Marcus's defenses. The pseudonym was protection, he admitted quietly. Mathematics should be judged on merit, not on who creates it. Dr. Wright nodded understanding. A noble ideal, though unfortunately not always the reality in academic circles. She closed the folder. "Your medical accommodation has been formally documented, by the way. Professor Harrington cannot penalize you for standing during lectures." "Thank you," Marcus said, genuine relief in his voice. "However," Dr. Wright continued, her expression becoming more serious, "your confrontation yesterday has created a complicated situation. Several students have now come forward with concerns about Professor Harrington's teaching methods. Your demonstration has catalyzed something." Marcus hadn't anticipated this ripple effect. "That wasn't my intention." Intentions aside, we're now facing legitimate questions about pedagogical approaches in the department. She studied him thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to present your methodology in a special departmental seminar? Not as M.J. Theorem, but as Marcus Johnson, a student with valuable mathematical insights." The proposal was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Public recognition would validate his approaches but would also expose him to exactly the kind of attention he'd been avoiding since the incident with Ms. Keller. Before he could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door, and without waiting for an answer, Professor Harrington strode in, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "Eleanor, we need to discuss," he stopped abruptly upon seeing Marcus. "I see. Having private consultations with students now?" "Professor Harrington," Dr. Wright acknowledged calmly. "Mr. Johnson and I were discussing his mathematical approach and its connections to published literature." Harrington's eyes narrowed. Whatever amateur techniques he's cobbled together hardly qualify as connectable to serious mathematical literature. Dr. Wright's expression remained professional but cooled noticeably. "Actually, Richard, his approach directly parallels methodologies published in the Journal of Mathematical Innovation, exactly as he stated in class yesterday." "That journal has become increasingly questionable in its standards," Harrington dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Publishing untested approaches from anonymous contributors like this M.J. Theorem character. Marcus watched the exchange silently, cataloging Harrington's deliberate attempts to devalue any mathematics that didn't conform to his rigid expectations. It was the same pattern he'd observed repeatedly, authority figures protecting their status by delegitimizing challenges to their expertise. Anonymous or not, Dr. Wright replied firmly, the mathematics stands on its own merit. And Mr. Johnson's demonstration yesterday showed impressive command of advanced concepts. Harrington's gaze shifted to Marcus, contempt barely concealed. A flashy performance doesn't constitute mathematical rigor. Mr. Johnson may have memorized some clever tricks, but he lacks the disciplined foundation necessary for serious mathematical work. Something in Marcus finally broke through his careful reserve. Years of dismissal, of being judged not by his work but by preconceptions about his abilities, crystallized in this moment. Professor Harrington, he said quietly but clearly, the approach I demonstrated yesterday wasn't memorized. It represents original work developing geometric interpretations of differential systems, work that extends beyond what's covered in undergraduate programs because it connects multiple mathematical domains in ways traditional approaches don't explore. The room fell silent. Dr. Wright watched with undisguised interest while Harrington's expression shifted from dismissal to confusion to dawning suspicion. You're claiming, Harrington said slowly, that you developed this methodology yourself? I'm stating a mathematical fact, Marcus replied evenly. The approach works. It's elegant. And it's valid regardless of who developed it. Dr. Wright intervened smoothly. Which brings us back to my proposal. I believe a departmental seminar showcasing innovative approaches would benefit our entire mathematical community. Don't you agree, Richard? Harrington was caught in a trap of academic etiquette. Refusing would appear close-minded, agreeing meant legitimizing Marcus's work. I maintain serious reservations about encouraging undergraduates to deviate from established methodologies, he said stiffly. But of course, I support departmental discourse. Excellent, Dr. Wright smiled. Then it's settled. Marcus, please consider my invitation. Richard, thank you for your input. The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Harrington exited with rigid formality, leaving Marcus alone again with Dr. Wright. He'll try to undermine you, she warned once the door closed. But if you're willing to present your work publicly, I believe it would benefit both you and the department. Marcus considered the complex equations of academic politics and personal vindication that now confronted him. The pseudonym had protected him, allowed his work to be judged on merit alone. Stepping into the light meant vulnerability, but also the chance to claim his rightful place in the mathematical community. I'll do it, he decided. On one condition. Which is that the presentation focuses on the mathematics, not the mathematician. No personal history, no special introductions about overcoming adversity. Just the work itself. Dr. Wright smiled with genuine appreciation. A pure mathematician to the core. Very well, Mr. Johnson. On those terms, we have an agreement. As Marcus left her office, he felt the weight of years of careful anonymity shifting. The mathematics that had been his private sanctuary was about to become his public identity, with all the recognition and scrutiny that entailed. What neither he nor Dr. Wright could fully anticipate was how Harrington would respond to this threat to his authority, or how deeply the roots of academic prejudice could reach when challenged by a student who refused to stay in his assigned place. Dr. Wright's office had become command central for what she privately termed the Johnson situation. On her desk lay an array of documents, Marcus's academic records, medical documentation, printed samples of M.J. Theorem's published work, and a transcript of Sophia Chen's recorded confrontation between Marcus and Professor Harrington. She sighed, removing her reading glasses. What had begun as academic friction had evolved into something much more concerning, a pattern of discriminatory behavior that potentially violated university policies. A knock at her door preceded the entrance of Dean Harris, the stern but fair administrator who oversaw faculty conduct issues. You wanted to see me about Professor Harrington, the dean asked, settling into a chair opposite Dr. Wright. Yes, though I'm afraid the situation has grown more complex than I initially realized. She pushed a folder across the desk. This contains evidence of a concerning pattern regarding one of our students, Marcus Johnson. Dean Harris skimmed the documents, his expression growing more troubled with each page. The medical records indicate previous physical abuse by an instructor. And Harrington has been forcing him to sit despite medical accommodation. That's just the beginning, Dr. Wright explained. What started as resistance to Marcus's standing during lectures has escalated into what appears to be targeted academic discrimination. She played a portion of Sophia's recording, showing Harrington's dismissal of Marcus's valid mathematical approach followed by the deliberate assignment of an unsolvable problem. The student solved it? Dean Harris asked, impressed despite his administrative detachment. Not exactly, the problem was designed to be unsolvable in traditional terms. What Marcus did was reframe it through a geometric approach that revealed its structural properties. Mathematically brilliant work that Harrington refused to acknowledge. The dean frowned. Academic disagreements happen all the time, Eleanor. What makes this different? Two things, Dr. Wright replied, pulling out additional files. First, I've compiled similar complaints from 5 other minority students over the past 3 years, all showing a pattern of Harrington setting different standards based on preconceptions about students' abilities. She paused, considering her next words carefully. Second, Marcus Johnson is almost certainly MJ Theorem, an anonymous mathematical contributor whose work has been published in respected journals and cited by researchers worldwide, including myself. The dean's eyebrows rose. And Harrington has been treating him like an underqualified student? Worse, he's been actively attempting to discredit methodologies that the broader mathematical community has already embraced. It's as if he's deliberately refusing to recognize innovation from sources he deems unworthy. Meanwhile, across campus, Marcus sat in the University Counseling Center, reluctantly sharing his story with Dr. Abernathy, a counselor specializing in academic trauma. The incident with Ms. Keller at your previous school, Dr. Abernathy prompted gently. Have you ever received proper support for that experience? Marcus shook his head. There wasn't time. Between medical appointments for my back and transferring schools to escape the situation, I just compartmentalized it. And now Professor Harrington's behavior is triggering those same feelings of powerlessness. Not powerlessness, Marcus corrected, surprising himself with the realization. What bothers me is the pattern, authorities using their position to devalue others based on preconceptions. Ms. Keller saw a scholarship student questioning her expertise. Harrington sees unorthodox approaches threatening his mathematical worldview. Dr. Abernathy nodded. And neither could separate the mathematics from the mathematician. Exactly. Marcus shifted, trying to find a comfortable position for his back. Pure mathematics should be the ultimate meritocracy, either an approach works or it doesn't. But the academic world surrounding it is anything but. Which is why you created MJ Theorem. Marcus looked up sharply. How did you? Dr. Wright mentioned it might come up, the counselor explained. Everything here is confidential, Marcus. But it seems significant that you felt the need to separate your identity from your mathematical contributions. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, something big happening. Wright and Harris reviewing H's conduct. Multiple students came forward. The situation was accelerating beyond his control. What had begun as his private struggle was becoming a departmental reckoning. Across campus, Sophia Chen sat in a conference room with 3 other students, each describing their experiences with Professor Harrington to a university administrator. After Marcus stood up to him, I realized I wasn't the only one, explained James, a first-generation college student. Harrington told me my cultural background might make advanced mathematics too challenging, suggested I switch to statistics instead. Aisha, wearing her hijab, nodded in agreement. He made a point of calling on me every class for 2 weeks after I returned from Eid celebration. When I answered correctly, he would act surprised. As these testimonies accumulated, Sophia's video evidence of the classroom confrontation took on new significance, not an isolated incident but part of a systemic issue that had gone unaddressed for years. Later that afternoon, in the mathematics department lounge, a different conversation was unfolding among graduate students and junior faculty. The proof methodology matches exactly, confirmed Dr. Patel, a young professor specializing in geometric approaches. I've studied MJ theorem's papers extensively. The techniques Johnson demonstrated in Harrington's class are identical to those in the published works. But how could an undergraduate develop such sophisticated approaches, questioned a skeptical graduate student. The same way Ramanujan developed advanced theories without formal training, replied Dr. Patel. Mathematical insight isn't confined to traditional academic pathways. As the day progressed, these separate conversations began converging toward an unavoidable conclusion. By evening, Dr. Wright found herself in an emergency meeting with Dean Harris and the university's legal counsel. We have sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal review of Professor Harrington's conduct, the lawyer confirmed. The medical accommodation violations alone are problematic, but the pattern of discriminatory treatment supported by multiple witnesses strengthens the case considerably. Dean Harris nodded gravely. And the mathematical dispute? Where does that factor in? Dr. Wright spread several academic journals on the table. I've confirmed through stylistic analysis and mathematical fingerprinting that Marcus Johnson is almost certainly MJ theorem. His approach that Harrington dismissed as amateur has been cited in 17 research papers in the past year alone, including 2 by Fields Medal recipients. The implications hung heavily in the room. A professor had systematically demeaned and dismissed a student whose mathematical contributions were reshaping the field, all while refusing to recognize the innovation because it came from a source he deemed unworthy. This goes beyond academic disagreement, Dr. Wright concluded quietly. It strikes at the heart of our institutional values. Either we believe in evaluating ideas on their merit, or we don't. As night fell over Westfield's campus, Marcus sat alone in his dorm room, attempting to focus on an upcoming assignment while ignoring the growing pain in his back. The medication Dr. Patel had prescribed helped somewhat, but stress always intensified the discomfort. His phone buzzed with another message from Dr. Wright, committee meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. Your presence requested but not required. Your choice. Marcus stared at the ceiling, weighing his options. He had come to Westfield seeking mathematical challenges and academic opportunity, not to become the centerpiece of a departmental controversy. Yet remaining silent now meant allowing patterns of discrimination to continue unchallenged. The equations before him blurred as exhaustion set in. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be reduced to elegant proofs or geometric transformations, human equations far messier than any mathematics he had mastered. But perhaps that was the point. The pure world of numbers had been his refuge precisely because the human world was so much more complex, so much more resistant to logical resolution. Now those worlds were colliding in ways he couldn't have anticipated, forcing him to step beyond the comfortable anonymity of MJ theorem into the complicated reality of being Marcus Johnson, a student demanding to be judged by the quality of his work rather than preconceptions about who could create it. As he finally drifted toward sleep, one certainty remained: whatever happened tomorrow would irrevocably change his academic journey, for better or worse. The mathematics department conference room felt unnaturally still as Marcus entered. The long oak table was surrounded by faculty members, with Dr. Wright at the head position and Dean Harris alongside her. Professor Harrington sat rigidly opposite them, his expression an indecipherable mask of professional neutrality. Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us, Dr. Wright said, gesturing to an empty chair. We appreciate your willingness to participate in this discussion. Marcus nodded, opting to stand behind the indicated chair rather than sit. I understand my presence was requested. Dean Harris cleared his throat. Yes. Professor Harrington has raised concerns about your academic approach in his advanced calculus course, while several of your classmates have raised counterpoints regarding his teaching methodology. We're here to address both perspectives. The dean's diplomatic framing belied the tension evident in the room. Several junior faculty members glanced uncomfortably between Harrington and Marcus, clearly recognizing the power imbalance at play. Dr. Wright opened a folder containing printed copies of the material she'd collected. Professor Harrington, you've characterized Mr. Johnson's mathematical approaches as unorthodox and undermining proper pedagogical methods. Could you elaborate on those concerns for the committee? Harrington straightened, his confidence unwavering. Certainly. Mathematics, particularly at the advanced undergraduate level, requires disciplined adherence to established methodologies. Mr. Johnson consistently employs intuitive shortcuts that circumvent the rigorous processes students must master before attempting creative approaches. He gestured dismissively toward Marcus. While these shortcuts occasionally produce correct numerical outcomes, they fail to demonstrate the comprehensive understanding our curriculum is designed to develop. Dr. Wright nodded, maintaining professional neutrality. And your assessment of Mr. Johnson's mathematical capabilities overall? Promising but undisciplined, Harrington replied without hesitation. Like many students from non-traditional backgrounds, he shows aptitude but lacks the structured foundation necessary for advanced work. Marcus noted the careful phrasing, non-traditional backgrounds, serving as a coded reference that everyone in the room understood. The subtle bias was so embedded in Harrington's worldview that he expressed it openly in a formal review meeting. Dr. Wright turned to Marcus. Mr. Johnson, would you care to respond to these characterizations of your work? Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself. The approaches I've employed are not shortcuts but alternative methodologies with sound mathematical foundations. They aren't intuitive guesses but deliberate applications of geometric reasoning to problems typically approached through algebraic methods. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. As for lacking structure, these approaches are structured, just not in the linear progression Professor Harrington prefers. Mathematics allows multiple valid paths to understanding. Recognizing these alternatives doesn't undermine rigor, it enriches it. Harrington scoffed audibly. That's precisely the kind of relativistic thinking that degrades mathematical standards. Next you'll suggest we accept incorrect solutions because they represent alternative approaches. My solutions aren't incorrect, Marcus replied evenly. They're verified by results. The difference is methodological, not substantive. Results without proper process aren't mathematics, they're guesswork, Harrington insisted. Dr. Wright intervened smoothly, pulling several academic journals from her folder. Let's examine the mathematical foundation of the approaches in question. I've compiled published works that employ methodologies similar to what Mr. Johnson demonstrated in class. She distributed the journals, each open to highlighted sections. These papers from the Journal of Mathematical Innovation, Mathematical Review Quarterly, and Advanced Computational Theory all utilize geometric transformation approaches comparable to Mr. Johnson's work. One of the junior professors examined a paper closely. This is the convergence problem solution published by M.J. Theorem last year. The approach is identical to what I saw in the video from Harrington's class. Murmurs spread around the table as faculty members recognized the connection. Harrington's expression darkened. These publications have increasingly questionable standards, he dismissed. They prioritize novelty over rigor. And this anonymous M.J. Theorem character, publishing without institutional affiliation or peer review, hardly constitutes legitimate mathematical authority. Dr. Wright maintained her composed demeanor. Actually, these papers underwent rigorous peer review. Several were reviewed by members of this department, including myself. And M.J. Theorem's work has been cited by Fields Medal recipients. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Johnson, there's a question I need to ask directly. Are you, in fact, the mathematician publishing under the pseudonym M.J. Theorem? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, who felt the weight of years of careful anonymity balanced against this moment of potential recognition. Yes, he acknowledged quietly. I am. The admission sent a ripple of reactions through the room, surprise from some faculty, vindication from others. Harrington's face flushed with a complex mixture of disbelief and anger. That's preposterous, he declared. An undergraduate student without formal training cannot be the author of these publications. This is clearly an attempt to legitimize inappropriate mathematical approaches through false claims. Dr. Wright was prepared for this response. She opened her laptop and turned it toward the committee. I've arranged a video call with Dr. Elaine Chen, editor of the Journal of Mathematical Innovation, who has corresponded extensively with MJ theorem. The call connected, showing a distinguished older woman in an office lined with mathematical texts. Good morning, Eleanor. I understand you have questions about one of our contributors. Yes, Elaine. We're trying to verify the identity of MJ theorem. I have Marcus Johnson here, who claims to be the author. Dr. Chen leaned forward with interest. Ah, finally putting a face to the mathematical mind. Hello, Marcus. I've been corresponding with you for what, almost 3 years now? 2 years and 8 months, Marcus confirmed. Could you verify his identity based on your correspondence? Dr. Wright asked. Of course. Our communications have been entirely through secure email, but MJ theorem has a distinctive writing style and mathematical approach. To confirm, I'd need Mr. Johnson to explain the key insight from his most recent submission, the one regarding differential topology that we're publishing next month. Marcus nodded and proceeded to outline a complex mathematical concept involving geometric transformations of topological spaces, technical details that flowed with confident precision. As he spoke, Dr. Chen nodded with increasing certainty. That's him, she confirmed when he finished. The explanation matches not just the content but the distinctive thought process evident in all MJ theorem's work. I'd bet my reputation on it. Harrington's face had grown increasingly rigid during this exchange. This proves nothing except his familiarity with these publications. Any student could memorize these concepts. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. Professor Harrington, I presume? The submission I referenced hasn't been published or shared publicly. The only people with access to these specific mathematical insights are the author and our review team. The evidence was becoming insurmountable. Several committee members exchanged meaningful glances as the implications sank in. Harrington had been systematically dismissing and demeaning a student whose mathematical contributions were recognized and respected throughout the academic community. Even if, and I emphasize if, Mr. Johnson has managed to publish these papers, Harrington attempted one final defense, it doesn't change the fact that his approach undermines the pedagogical structure of my course. As the instructor, I have the right to maintain methodological standards. Dean Harris, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. Professor Harrington, academic freedom indeed grants you considerable latitude in your teaching methods. However, it doesn't extend to dismissing valid mathematical approaches, especially those with substantial scholarly backing. He gestured toward the medical documentation in the file. Nor does it permit ignoring official accommodations for documented disabilities, which appears to have occurred repeatedly in your interactions with Mr. Johnson. The systematic dismantling of Harrington's position was proceeding with the same methodical precision as a mathematical proof. Each point built upon the previous, leading toward an inevitable conclusion. Harrington, recognizing his increasingly untenable position, shifted tactics. This entire proceeding feels predetermined. A talented student has difficulty adjusting to rigorous standards, rallies support through emotional appeals, and suddenly the instructor with 30 years of experience is on trial. This sets a dangerous precedent for educational standards. His attempt to reframe the narrative fell flat against the accumulated evidence. Dr. Wright closed her folder deliberately. Richard, this isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing when our predetermined notions of who can excel mathematically might be limiting our own understanding of the field. Her voice was firm but not unkind. The evidence suggests that you've been dismissing innovative approaches not because they lack validity, but because they come from sources you've deemed unworthy of serious consideration. The silence that followed was profound. Around the table, faculty members confronted not just Harrington's actions but the subtle biases that had been normalized within academic structures, biases that determined whose insights were considered valuable and whose were dismissed. Marcus remained standing, his expression composed despite the emotional weight of the moment. Years of having his mathematical insight questioned, of being forced to hide behind a pseudonym to have his work judged on merit alone, had culminated in this public recognition, not just of his mathematical ability but of the systemic barriers he'd navigated to express it. As the meeting continued, the discussion shifted toward appropriate responses and remedial actions. But for Marcus, something fundamental had already changed. The equations governing his academic life had been irrevocably transformed, revealing new possibilities for what might lie beyond this difficult variable. The university quadrangle buzzed with students enjoying the spring sunshine, oblivious to the deliberations taking place in the administration building's conference room. Inside, the review board, comprised of senior faculty, administrative officers, and student representatives, was concluding its formal investigation into the situation that had become known informally as the Harrington-Johnson case. Marcus sat at one end of the long table, Sophia beside him offering silent support. Across from them, Professor Harrington maintained his rigid posture, occasionally consulting with the faculty advocate who had agreed to advise him during the proceedings. University President Dr. Josephine Torres entered, bringing the room to attention with her authoritative presence. As the first black woman to lead Westfield, she had made academic equity a cornerstone of her administration. "Thank you all for your diligence throughout this review process," she began, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I've studied the committee's findings and recommendations thoroughly." She turned first to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, your mathematical contributions both in class and through your published work as MJ theorem represent the kind of innovative thinking Westfield should nurture. The fact that you felt compelled to publish under a pseudonym to have your work judged fairly is something our institution must address seriously." Next, she addressed Harrington. "Professor Harrington, your decades of service to this university are acknowledged. However, the evidence demonstrates a pattern of behavior incompatible with our institutional values and policies." She opened a folder containing the official findings. "The review board has determined that multiple violations occurred, including failure to honor official medical accommodations, application of inconsistent academic standards based on preconceptions about students' abilities, and creation of a hostile learning environment through public humiliation tactics." Harrington began to protest, but President Torres raised her hand. "The evidence is substantial and corroborated by multiple witnesses, Professor. The question before us now is the appropriate institutional response." Dean Harris distributed copies of the board's recommendations. "After careful consideration, we are implementing the following measures. First, Professor Harrington will be placed on probationary status for 2 semesters, during which his courses will be subject to ongoing review. Second, he continued, mandatory participation in the university's equity and inclusion training program will be required before resuming regular teaching duties. Third, an independent evaluation of grading practices across all courses taught by Professor Harrington over the past 5 years will be conducted to identify any patterns of bias. And finally, President Torres added, the mathematics department will establish a formal colloquium series highlighting diverse methodological approaches, with the inaugural session featuring Mr. Johnson's work on geometric transformations in calculus." Harrington's face had grown increasingly flushed during these pronouncements. "This is nothing short of academic persecution," he declared. 30 years of distinguished service reduced to sensitivity training and supervised teaching. All because one student couldn't adapt to rigorous standards. Dr. Wright, who had remained silent until now, spoke firmly. "Richard, the mathematical community has already validated Mr. Johnson's approaches through peer review and citation. This isn't about rigor versus leniency, it's about recognizing that mathematical insight can emerge from diverse perspectives and methodologies. Furthermore," added a committee member from the physics department, "your claim about one student is factually incorrect. The investigation identified similar patterns affecting at least 11 students over the past 3 years, predominantly affecting minority and first-generation college students. The comprehensive nature of the investigation had revealed what individual complaints could not, a systematic pattern that extended far beyond Marcus's personal experience." As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a complex mixture of vindication and discomfort. The public recognition of his mathematical contributions was validating, but the formal proceedings had forced him into precisely the kind of spotlight he had always avoided. Outside the conference room, Sophia squeezed his arm supportively. "You okay?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I came here to study mathematics, not become a departmental case study." "You became much more than that," she corrected gently. "You became a catalyst for change." Dr. Wright approached them in the hallway. "Marcus, I wanted to let you know, the Disability Services Office has completed reviewing their accommodation procedures. Your case highlighted several bureaucratic gaps that are being addressed to prevent similar situations in the future. She handed him an envelope. Also, the department has approved your request for an independent study project next semester. You'll have access to advanced computational resources and faculty mentorship. No pseudonym required. The gesture represented more than academic opportunity, it was institutional acknowledgement of his mathematical gifts, free from the prejudices that had constrained his previous educational experiences. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the University Medical Center for his scheduled physical therapy appointment. Dr. Patel greeted him with a warm smile. Your case has actually prompted some changes around here, she informed him as she examined his back. The medical center is implementing new protocols for documenting and supporting students with chronic pain conditions. The administration realized how easily these issues can be dismissed without proper advocacy. I never intended to become an advocate, Marcus said, wincing slightly as she found a particularly sensitive spot. The most effective advocates rarely do, she replied wisely. They simply insist on being treated with dignity until the system has no choice but to change. As Marcus left the medical center, he noticed a small group of students gathered near the mathematics building. To his surprise, they were participants in a new student-led support group for underrepresented mathematics majors, inspired partly by his experience with Harrington. One of them, a young woman named Zainab who had dropped Harrington's class after his first intimidating lecture, approached Marcus hesitantly. We're organizing study sessions that explore different problem-solving approaches, she explained. People share methodologies from different educational backgrounds. Would you consider leading a session sometime? The request represented everything Marcus had always avoided: public visibility, leadership, being identified as different. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in his perspective since that first confrontation with Harrington. I'll think about it, he promised, surprising himself with his openness to the possibility. As he walked across campus, Marcus realized that the very thing that had made him vulnerable, his different approach to mathematics, had ultimately become his greatest strength. The equation of his academic identity was balancing in new ways, with variables he was only beginning to understand. The following week, the first of several systemic changes became evident. A formal announcement from the mathematics department outlined a revised policy for evaluating alternative methodologies, explicitly acknowledging that mathematical validity could take multiple forms. Without naming Marcus directly, the influence of his case was unmistakable throughout the document. In the president's office, Dr. Torres was meeting with university donors, including several alumni from the mathematics program. The Johnson case represents both a failure and an opportunity, she explained to the gathered supporters. A failure in our systems of inclusion, but an opportunity to establish Westfield as a leader in recognizing mathematical talent regardless of background or approach. By the end of the meeting, preliminary funding had been secured for a new scholarship program specifically designed to support mathematically gifted students from underserved communities, a direct response to the barriers Marcus had faced throughout his educational journey. Justice, Marcus was learning, sometimes came not through dramatic confrontations but through the gradual realignment of institutional equations toward more balanced outcomes. The variables were changing, one policy at a time. 6 months later, the mathematics department's largest lecture hall was filled beyond capacity. Students sat in aisles and stood along walls to witness something unprecedented, an undergraduate student delivering the semester's most anticipated mathematical colloquium. Marcus Johnson stood at the front, back straight and voice clear as he guided the audience through a presentation titled Geometric Visualization in Complex Integration. Gone was the hesitant student who had once hidden in the back of Harrington's classroom. In his place stood a confident young mathematician whose innovative approaches were reshaping calculus education at Westfield. The beauty of mathematics, Marcus explained, illustrating his point with elegant diagrams, lies not just in reaching correct solutions, but in revealing the multiple pathways that lead to understanding. When we limit ourselves to a single approach, we miss the rich landscape of possibilities. In the front row, Dr. Wright nodded appreciatively. Beside her sat Dr. Elaine Chen, who had traveled from her university specifically to meet the young mathematician whose papers she had been publishing for years. Sophia, now Marcus's research partner in an advanced project funded by the National Science Foundation, managed the technical aspects of the presentation from a side table. Their collaboration had blossomed into both a productive academic partnership and a deepening personal connection. Even Professor Harrington was present, seated near the back with a carefully neutral expression. His required equity training had only recently concluded, and while colleagues reported little evidence of profound transformation in his attitudes, the formal oversight of his teaching had enforced at least performative changes in his classroom behavior. As Marcus concluded his presentation to enthusiastic applause, Dr. Wright took the podium for a brief announcement. We're pleased to share that Westfield University is establishing the Diversity in Mathematical Thought initiative, dedicated to recognizing and supporting innovative approaches from underrepresented perspectives. She gestured toward Marcus. And we're even more pleased to announce that Marcus Johnson will help shape this program as our first undergraduate student representative on the Mathematics Curriculum Committee. The announcement represented more than personal recognition. It was institutional acknowledgement that the structures of mathematical education themselves needed reconsideration. After the colloquium, as attendees lingered to discuss the presentation, a tentative figure approached Marcus, a young black student named Darius who had been watching the proceedings with particular intensity. Your approach to the visualization technique, Darius began hesitantly, it reminds me of how my grandfather taught me to think about functions when I was little. He never had formal education, but he could see patterns in everything. Marcus recognized something familiar in the student's demeanor, the careful way he presented his thoughts, the uncertainty about whether his perspective would be valued. That's exactly the kind of insight we need more of, Marcus encouraged. Mathematics exists in many contexts beyond formal education. Sometimes the most innovative approaches come from outside traditional pathways. I've been working on some ideas, Darius admitted, but they don't follow the standard methods we learn in class. I'd like to see them sometime, Marcus offered, remembering how transformative Dr. Wright's early recognition had been for his own confidence. Later that evening, Marcus found himself in a quiet moment of reflection as he stood at the window of the mathematics building, gazing across the campus that had become both his battlefield and his home. His back still troubled him at times, a permanent reminder of Ms. Keller's violence, but proper medical treatment had reduced the pain to a manageable level. Some wounds, he had learned, never completely heal, they simply become part of who you are. His phone buzzed with a notification, another acceptance from a mathematics journal, this time for a paper published under his real name rather than his pseudonym. The transition from anonymous contributor to recognized mathematician felt symbolic of his broader journey from silence to voice. The MJ theorem pseudonym now existed as a relic of necessary protection in a world that had initially refused to see his brilliance clearly. He would always carry the lessons of that experience, how structural barriers could obscure genuine talent, how assumptions about who could excel in mathematics affected opportunities for recognition. But as he gathered his materials to leave, Marcus felt something he had rarely experienced in academic settings before, a sense of genuine belonging. Not because he had conformed to others' expectations, but because he had held firm to his unique mathematical vision until the institution began to expand its understanding of excellence. The following week, the university newspaper published a feature on the new scholarship program for underprivileged mathematics students, formally named the Johnson Theorem Initiative in recognition of Marcus's influence on departmental policies. The accompanying photo showed Marcus standing confidently before a classroom of diverse students, his posture revealing no trace of the pain that had once defined his educational experience. In that image, captured as he guided students through alternative approaches to standard calculus problems, was the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself during his darkest moments at Douglas Community College, that someday, he would create the supportive educational environment he had never experienced himself. As one student in the photo put it, in Professor Johnson's classroom, there's no single right way to solve a problem. There's just the beautiful challenge of finding your path through the mathematics. It was, Marcus reflected, the equation he had been solving all along, how to transform personal adversity into systematic change, how to balance the variables of individual brilliance against institutional resistance, and ultimately, how to prove that genius could emerge from unexpected sources when given the space to flourish on its own terms. Dear friend, this story reminds us that brilliance comes in all forms and from all backgrounds. Too often, we judge people's abilities based on appearances, accents, or circumstances rather than giving everyone an equal opportunity to demonstrate their talents. Marcus's journey shows that sometimes the most innovative thinking comes from those who've been forced to find different paths to knowledge. His perseverance changed not just his own future, but transformed an entire institution's approach to education and inclusion. If this story touched you, please like this video to help others find it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and triumph over prejudice. Together, we can build a world where everyone's genius is recognized, regardless of where they come from or how they learn.